We've been taking a long look at Christianity in the Roman Empire. Thus far, we've looked at life in the early church, the phenomenon of what we might call cultural Christians in the Pax Romana. On the third part of this mini-series, we talked about the most common accusations against the Christians. And today, part 4, I'd like to follow up on that episode by looking at how Christian apologists defended their faith against a growing culture of skepticism and even hostility. The early apologists were impressive men. Philosophers like Justin Martyr, legal experts like Tertullian, using law and logic to argue for the legitimacy of Christianity. Christian apologists were aggressive, debunking the worship of Roman gods as illogical and even immoral, explaining the meaning and significance of Christian rituals like baptism and the Eucharist or the Lord's Supper. And as a result, the writings of these men made their way into the highest echelons of Roman society, including Roman emperors. All that and more on this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Episode 64, Christianity in the Roman Empire, Part 4. Thanks for listening to this episode of the Pax Romana podcast. Don't forget to subscribe to the podcast. Feel free to leave a comment as well. Those are the things that signal to Spotify that people are listening to the podcast, and it's a great way to let me know that you're enjoying the content I produce on this podcast. So thanks a bunch for your support. Let's get to today's episode. On the last episode of this podcast, I placed the opposition to Christianity into 5 categories. First, for the name, Christians were derided and in some cases persecuted just on the basis of being called Christians. It didn't really matter what they said or they did, just being associated with Christianity was enough in the eyes of some in the Roman Empire, including some very powerful people like the Emperor Trajan, to justify rounding Christians up and ultimately executing them. A second charge against the Christians was atheism, and I explained how in Roman religion, belief was far less important than practice, and Christians, because of their belief in Jesus Christ as the one true Son of God, decided to not participate in many of the traditional rites and rituals associated with Roman religion. For the Romans, it didn't matter that Christians believed in God. The problem was they did not practice religion, and this opened them up to the charge of atheism. Thirdly, Christians were seen as seditious. They refused to honor the emperor in the traditional ways by burning incense and taking vows, even in some cases worshiping statues of emperors. Fourthly, Christians were accused of various immoral and culturally deviant practices. Rituals such as baptism and the Lord's Supper were twisted around to suggest that Christians were engaged in private debaucheries, including things like cannibalism and orgies and other unsavory acts associated with evil cults. And Christian apologists had to defend themselves against this claim as well. Finally, and fifthly, was the idea of novelty. Romans accepted ancient religions, even that they didn't agree with much, such as Judaism, as long as it was clear that there was a kind of consistency over the centuries in these religions and that they worked, that the peoples that practiced those religions continued to honor their gods, and as a result, their gods preserved those people. The Romans may have conquered Jewish people, but it was evident to many Romans that the Jewish God had preserved those people even in the midst of enduring numerous subjugations to imperial powers. But the Christians did not have a lengthy history. If anything, they looked like Jewish people that had totally abandoned their ancestral practices. For the Romans, this amounted to what they call superstitio, which is the word we derive our term superstition from. A kind of newfangled fad religion that was dangerous, and it didn't help that Christians were evangelistic, and they were converting others to superstitious thinking. So these 5 concerns were the main criticisms that were levied against Christians. Now, the question is, how did Christians defend themselves against such accusations? Now, Christians, as a subsample of people in the ancient world, were not overwhelmingly literate. However, there were Christian converts who were well educated, had backgrounds in philosophy and rhetoric. They knew how to make arguments, and they had elite connections. And so from the 2nd century onward, we find apologia. These are defenses addressed to magistrates, governors, and even emperors. Published arguments, clear and straightforward. They relied on culturally understood principles, ideas from Roman law, empirical evidence of what Christians did and why they did it. In some cases, they quoted Hebrew scriptures. And the point here was to address specifically that 5th charge of superstition and novelty. One of the best ways for Christians to dispel the charge of superstition or novelty was to show that Christianity had roots in ancient Judaism. So let's look at how Christians defended against each of these claims. First, the most basic one, for the name, simply identifying as a Christian. One of the Christian apologists that refuted this claim was Justin Martyr, a well-educated, local Greek elite from Judea. He was thoroughly Hellenized. That is, he embraced Greek culture. He had tried out numerous philosophies, and later in his life, and Justin Martyr lived from around AD 100 to AD 165 or thereabouts, late in his life, he converted to Christianity. And he wrote a defense of Christianity to the emperor Antoninus Pius. Now, eventually, Justin would be executed under the reign of Marcus Aurelius. Here is what Justin Martyr says in his apology about the accusation of the Christian name itself being odious. Quote, "By the mere application of a name, nothing is decided, either good or evil. From a name, neither praise nor punishment could reasonably spring, unless something excellent or base in action be proved. Justice requires that you inquire into the life both of him who confesses and of him who denies, that by his deeds it may be apparent what kind of man each is." Justin is saying that a name in and of itself is neither good nor evil, but Roman law requires that magistrates investigate the actions and deeds of those accused of something, not simply assume deeds and actions based on an identity category. The defense is quite simple. No just court would condemn somebody on the basis of a name alone. Well, what about the charge of atheism? This is a more challenging accusation, not worshiping the gods. Christian apologists are quite thorough about this charge because it is the most entrenched argument against them. Again, the prevailing logic of Roman religion is that worship of the gods requires right rituals. One of the Christian intellectuals to really attack this argument is Tertullian, a Phoenician from North Africa, a lawyer by profession, the son of a soldier who lives as the Pax Romana is falling apart, born around 155 and dies in the 220s AD. Tertullian did not begin life in a Christian family or as a Christian convert. It was actually in the middle of his life, around the turn of the century, that he became a Christian. And some wonder if his wife actually became a Christian first. But once Tertullian was converted, he wrote numerous tracts and treatises about Christianity, and we have many of those. His comments on atheism are found in Tertullian's Apology. Here is what he says in part, quote, "You do not worship the gods, you say, and you do not offer sacrifices for the emperors. Well, we do not offer sacrifice for others for the same reason that we do not for ourselves, namely, that your gods are not at all the objects of our worship. So we're accused of sacrilege and treason. We do not worship your gods because we know that there are no such beings. You should call on us to demonstrate their non-existence, and thereby prove that they have no claim to adoration. For only if your gods were truly so would there be any obligation to render divine homage." So Tertullian's attack here is a bit of a sidestep. Okay, sure, Christians don't worship the Roman gods. You got us. The Roman gods aren't real. And if you just ask us, we can prove it to you. And if they're not real, by the way, there's no point in sacrificing to them. Now, this was a pretty common tactic to defend against the charge of atheism. We see it also in a work called the Epistle to Diogenes, and this is a mid-2nd century defense of Christianity. We don't know who the author is, but this is what the author says, quote, "These things you call gods, these you serve, these you worship, and you become altogether like them. For this reason you hate the Christians, because they do not deem these to be gods. But do you not yourselves much more cast contempt upon them than the Christians? Do you not much more mock and insult them when you worship those that are made of stone and earthenware, without appointing any persons to guard them? But those made of silver and gold you shut up by night, and appoint watchers to look after them by day, lest they be stolen. And by those gifts which you mean to present to them, do you not, if they are possessed of sense, rather punish than honor them? You worship the gods with blood and the smoke of sacrifices. Not a single human being will, unless compelled to it, endure such treatment, since he is endowed with sense and reason. A stone, however, readily bears it, seeing it is insensible." Now, the point here is that the gods worshipped by many in the Roman Empire are just idols made by human beings. It's silly to pretend that they are greater than human beings. They don't even have senses. And the people that worship them act as though those gods aren't real. If a person makes a gold idol, they protect it as though it's going to be stolen. But if a person makes a stone idol, nobody protects it. But can't the gods protect themselves? In other words, it's illogical to worship gods in ways that we ourselves find offensive. What person would wish for a bunch of blood to be sprinkled on them or smoke to be blown in their face? So the argument here is that non-Christians give no compelling reason to worship idols, and their actions suggest that even they don't really believe that their gods are real. A second argument that Tertullian makes against atheism has to do with the morality of the gods. That is, shouldn't the gods actually act in ways that are above base human imperfections and frailties? This is what Tertullian says in his Apology, quote, "I would have you then consider whether the merits of your deities are of a kind to have raised them to the heavens, and not rather to have sunk them down to the lowest depths of Tartarus, the place which you regard, with many, as the prison house of infernal punishments. For into this dread place are wont to be cast all who offend against filial piety, and such are guilty of incest with sisters, and seducers of wives, and ravishers of virgins, and boy polluters, and men of furious tempers, and murderers, and thieves, and deceivers, all in short, who tread in the footsteps of your gods, not one of whom you can prove free from crime or vice." Tertullian is asking his audience to engage in a thought exercise. If Roman gods were real, would it still make sense to worship them? These are profoundly immoral beings. They're so immoral that they would deserve punishment if they were judged on the standards of regular people. The myths about Roman gods include murdering family members, incest, serial adultery, rape, pedophilia, thievery, and a variety of other attributes that are not worthy of worship. Tertullian also addresses the third accusation against Christians, that is, sedition, the refusal to honor the emperor and be loyal to him. And for this argument, Tertullian rests on the momentary freedom of speech that was allowed in some areas in the Pax Romana. He writes in his Apology, quote, "Why are we not permitted an equal liberty and impunity for our doctrines as philosophers have? And why are not they pressed to the same offices for declining which our lives are imperiled? For who compels a philosopher to sacrifice or take an oath? No, they openly overthrow your gods, and in their writings they attack your superstitions, and you applaud them for it. Many of them even, with your countenance, bark out against your rulers, and are rewarded with statues and salaries instead of being given to the wild beasts." Tertullian notes that philosophers, by their very job, were often critical of both the gods and the state and the people that ruled the state. People, in fact, even admire philosophers for the skepticism that they show. Some emperors have even rewarded philosophers with statues and other honors. Why should Christians be treated any differently? Fourthly, for the charge of immorality, that Christian practices were socially, culturally, and morally deviant. Christian apologists took two approaches here. First, to explain what it was they actually did. And second, to show that what they actually did was good and beneficial for people. Justin Martyr, for example, took this approach in his apology. Quote, "But we, after we have thus washed him who has been convinced and has assented to our teaching, bring him to the place where those who are called brethren are assembled. Having ended the prayers, we salute one another with a kiss. Those who are called by us deacons give to each of those present to partake of the bread and wine mixed with water, over which the thanksgiving was pronounced. And to those who are absent, they carry away a portion." In other words, the Lord's Supper is normal food and drink. It is part of a common meal. And baptism is a washing, as Justin Martyr explains it. It brings a convert into the body of Christians. It was a ritual delivered to Christians by the apostles. Jesus himself was baptized, and Christians are baptized in the name of Jesus. So they have legitimate rituals, and those rituals are very sensible. That's the argument here. And Christians also made the claim that these rituals were generally good for the community. One of the people making this argument was Aristides, a Greek convert to Christianity and a philosopher writing in the mid-2nd century. In his apology addressed to the Emperor Hadrian, which is, by the way, the oldest surviving work of Christian apologetics, he notes that Christianity is a brotherhood of strangers, men and women united into a new family that cares for one another. This is what he says, quote, "When the Christians see a stranger, they take him into their homes and rejoice over him as a very brother. For they do not call them brethren after the flesh, but brethren after the Spirit and in God. And whenever one of their poor passes from the world, each one of them, according to his ability, gives heed to him and carefully sees to his burial. And if there is among them any that is poor and needy, and if they have no spare food, they fast 2 or 3 days in order to supply the needy their lack of food." Christians care for each other as a family. That's the point here. They bury their dead, they distribute food to the poor, and they do this through sacrificing. Now, it's not animal sacrifices, but it is a form of doing without so that others can have. And there's something else going on here which you would miss if you didn't understand the cultural context. Roman culture allows for mutual aid societies. There were plenty of what were called collegia. These are clubs or groups, usually of men, that would gather together, often for religious purposes, and there would be a kind of membership fee, and this would go into a collective pool that would take care of some of the members' basic needs. Christianity, through its system of charity and giving and ensuring that Christians are buried, sounds a lot like one of these collegia. So it is not as crazy or foreign or immoral as some of the accusers suggest. Finally, there is that charge of superstition or novelty, that Christianity is an invented cult and that Christians have abandoned their roots. I'll read you a little bit from Justin Martyr's apology, which addresses this point directly. "In the books of the prophets, we find Jesus our Christ foretold as coming, born of a virgin, growing up to man's estate, and healing every disease and every sickness, and raising the dead, and being hated and unrecognized, and crucified, and dying, and rising again, and ascending into heaven, and being called the Son of God. We find it also predicted that certain persons should be sent by him into every nation to publish these things, and that rather among the Gentiles, instead of the Jews, men should believe in him." Justin is saying that Jesus did not come out of nowhere, but had been foretold by prophecy in Jewish scriptures, even the very details of his ministry foretold. Justin also makes the claim here that the church is foretold in ancient scriptures, that what he and other Christians are doing is actually part of God's plan. The implication here, of course, is that the Romans cannot stop it. Now, there is a subtle implication here, which may have been unsettling for the readers of Justin's apology, and that is, not only was Jesus and his church foretold in ancient scripture, but it is a true divine work, and therefore it cannot be stopped. Not by emperors, not by empires, but as we'll see in the next episode, many Romans, including emperors, will make attempts to stop Christianity dead in its tracks. Will they be successful? I think you know the answer, but we will still talk about it on the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.
Thanks for listening to the Pax Romana podcast. For more information, including a list of primary sources and further reading, check the show notes. Music by Red Productions and Exocore. Follow Professor Colin Elliott on X at ProfCPE or email colin@paxromanapodcast.com. Listen to more episodes on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or just about anywhere podcasts are available. Stay tuned for the next episode of the Pax Romana podcast.